Daily Tech News Show is made possible by you listening right now. Thanks to all of you, including Vince Power, Chris Beneteau, Jeffrey Zilks, and brand new patron Julian. Woo-hoo. Welcome, Julian.
Yay.
On this episode of DTNS, Dr. Andrea Jones-Rooy joins us to talk about what data science says about political polarization, and Dr. Maryanne Garry with more research on why LLMs continue to persuade us to believe them, even when we might know better. This is the Daily Tech News for Monday, December 16th, 2024, live in Los Angeles. I'm Tom Merritt.
I'm the show's producer, Roger Chang.
And joining us, data science professor and host of Behind the Data podcast, Andrea Jones-Rooy. Welcome back.
Hello. Thank you so much. I'll be representing the East Coast in today's episode.
In today's episode with PhDs.
That's right. That's correct.
We have Roger and I on the West Coast, you on the East Coast, and then someone from New Zealand. So
right.
We cover the world today.
The sun never sets on the Daily Tech News Show.
On Daily Tech News Show.
Yep.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Let's start, though, with the quick hits. A U.S. federal court in the District of Columbia has denied ByteDance's request to issue an injunction against the enforcement of a law that will require it to divest TikTok USA by January 19th or face a prohibition against distribution of the app in the country. That's important to remember. Just distribution. It's not going to stop you from using TikTok if you already have it. The top Republican and Democrat of the U.S. House Committee on China sent a joint letter to Alphabet and Apple, reminding them, in case they missed it, that they need to be prepared to block distribution of the TikTok app starting January 19th. The UK regulator Ofcom has released the first guidelines for the Online Safety Act, which it says is now in effect. It will require social media companies to remove illegal content like CSAM and terrorism-related content, and also to respond to crises like riots. Wall Street Journal reports that Apple plans to offer two foldable devices now. One would be a laptop-like device, at least that's how Wall Street Journal described it, that could unfold into a 19-inch tablet display. The other would be a foldable phone that would unfold into a screen slightly larger than the iPhone 16 Pro Max. The phone may come out first, possibly in 2026, though technical challenges might still delay it. Over on the subreddit, RW Nash submitted this one. The European Union signed a 12-year contract with an industry consortium called SpaceRise to fund the development of a satellite internet service called Infrastructure for Resilience, Interconnectivity, and Security by Satellite, or IRIS-2. Rather than Iris, because there's two S's at the end. In addition to internet service, it will also provide government security and crisis management capability. And C.W. Basden posted on the subreddit the story that more than 600 artists have signed an open letter demanding UMG drop its lawsuit against the Internet Archive. UMG is leading a group of other music labels suing the online library over its work to preserve recordings from 78 RPM records. Ooh, 78. Earlier this month, Merriam-Webster picked polarization as the word of the year, but outside of news pundits, is there empirical data showing that politics is as polarized as we think? Andrea has been elbow deep in this topic for Behind the Data. What have you learned? Let's talk about it.
It's going to be a while before I recover from the image of myself being elbow deep in polarization. But it is true. I have been thinking about it way too much. And so polarization is on everyone's mind. It's on my mind constantly. And one of the things that I love about being a data scientist is you get to ask questions that are fun at every party, such as, what's the empirical evidence for this thing that we're all having an animated conversation about?
And the room goes quiet.
Exactly. And so if someone's like, I'm going to go get a drink, and everyone follows them out. And so that's why I'm here alone in this room talking to you, as everyone has left my house. But yeah, so polarization is something that we feel polarized. Merriam-Webster knows what they're talking about. Polarization is in the news. But you might be wondering, if we are polarized, how would that show up in the data? And that's one of my favorite parts of data science, is thinking about how to translate things that are kind of abstract or maybe complex, but around us, like polarization. And how would you turn that into a number? How would we actually document polarization among American people? And the answer, I think, you can tell me if you disagree, but I think is very interesting. it turns out it's very easy to measure polarization. Well, I should say it's more straightforward to measure polarization among our leaders. So members of Congress, when they're in active session, they vote publicly on bills, and smart people can sit down and say, this bill is X% liberal or X% conservative, and you can do this over time, and it's a public record. And of course, it's not, an exact measure, but you have a pretty regular record of many, many votes over the course of a congressional session, and you can roughly estimate how far to the left or how far to the right any of our legislators are. And again, not perfect, but pretty decent. And it turns out there is increasing polarization in the sense that we do see a growing divide between the left and the right as far as how left and how right they are. And in particular, the right is moving to the right faster and the left is moving to the left slower, but there is a bit of a gap.
But they're both moving. And is that like a semantic analysis of the bills, or how do they decide if a bill itself leans one way or the other?
So it's definitely something that can be and is debated considerably. In this particular case, there are multiple dimensions you can consider it on. And generally, I think most of us will agree that the left-right continuum doesn't really capture all the differences in political views. But really, they think about it as liberal or conservative in terms of the classical economic sense. Is it increasing government spending or decreasing it? But there are also additional measures that are used less because they're a little bit trickier to pin down, which is it socially to the left or to the right? Is it pro-LGBTQ, that sort of thing, or not?
Okay.
But it is tricky, and it's certainly not a perfect measure by any sense. So it's not that the story is nailed down for our legislators, but generally speaking, it's pretty clear just in terms of how, if nothing else, you can see how much overlap there is between Democrats and Republicans in terms of how many bills is there bipartisan support for?
Right.
And that is shrinking.
Yeah, so it's very clear in the U.S. anyway, and it seems like in other countries as well, that the legislators getting put in office are more polarized. That the data is showing that.
If you're convinced that this particular route of measuring how they're voting on things, but basically the idea is like, political scientists and data scientists said, we're satisfied. Like the patterns kind of look like how it feels. It seems like they're all screaming at each other. It seems like they're not agreeing with one another. Pretty good. Okay, what about regular people? So in the US, and again, this is true for a lot of countries, we might say, well, how could we find data to suggest whether we are polarized? Well, we vote too, as many of you just did if you're in the United States and listening. We don't vote that often, so it's not nearly as much data as our legislators. And there is more voting along single party tickets. So it used to be the case that I might vote for a Democrat for president, but Republican for some of the lower down ballots and maybe independent, or whatever. There's a lot more straight tickets. So if I'm voting D at the top, it's all the way down, R at the top, it's all the way down. So that could be evidence of polarization, but it could also just be a reflection of our legislators being more extreme. If we had more overlap in our legislators, I might have more reason to vote a mix of D and R. But if they're divided, so that's not really enough. So scientists weren't happy to say that maybe polarization, but maybe not. When you look at Merriam-Webster's definition, it says it's opposing views. It's views that are at the poles, that are at either side of a political spectrum or of a spectrum of opinions, and they're concentrated there. So you might say, well, let's look at Americans' opinions on particular issues.
Sure.
Abortion is one where you do see this big divide. So Democrats, people who self-identify as Democrats, there's generally about slowly but surely increasing percentage of Americans who identify as Democrats say that they are pro-abortion, or not pro-abortion, but think it should be legal and all those things. And there's definitely a strong downturn among self-identified Republicans, and these are in major public opinion surveys. But
now I've heard, I was, before you get to the but, I've heard that yes, I just want to build up the tension.
Yeah, let's go.
I've heard that this is one where most Americans agree, but I don't think that conflicts with what you're saying. What you're saying is the opinions are drifting more. Is that right?
That's right. And this is when you divide Americans by, so the way that these surveys work, and the one I'm referencing is something called the American National Election Survey. And it's the longest running survey of American people, different from the political polls that happen all the time. It's like a once every handful of years, we're going to survey and sit down with people and ask lots and lots of long, detailed questions. So if they say, hey, are you a Democrat or Republican? You answer that. If you identified as Democrat, would you say strongly Democrat, regular Democrat, weakly Democrat, the same over there? Or if you say I'm independent, would you say, are you independent and you lean Democrat, you lean right? And so once people answer those questions, and by the way, that divide, it's not the case. Polarization, you might think, oh, way more of us are only Democrats or only Republicans. If anything, the percentage of Americans in these surveys over the past 50 years who've identified as independents has increased. And there's only a teeny tiny uptick in the last maybe 10 years of folks who say, instead of, regular Republican or regular Democrat, who say strongly. So there's a little bit of an increase in folks who say, yeah, I'm strongly Republican, less of that kind of increase on Democrats. But again, as a scientist and someone who lives in the world, that little uptick doesn't quite feel like enough. So for the example with abortion, if you divide, you say, yes, okay, those who said Democrat are generally more likely to say abortion should be legal in most cases. Those who self-identify as Republican, you do see that decrease. But you're right. On average, if you kind of erase those party IDs, generally speaking, most Americans are kind of moderate on abortion, which is to say we think it should be legal, but shouldn't,
with
be
limits.
free or handed out at vending machines per Selena in Veep. But if you look at the other issues and think about, gun control, government spending, the environment, most Americans are kind of in the middle. Yes, there's a gap. So people who are self-identify as Democrats say, yeah, I'm more in favor of government spending, say, for various social programs. And Republicans, look at my cool graphs, are below that. But that gap hasn't increased. It's stayed roughly the same over decades. So it's not that we're more polarized. Yes, we disagree, but we don't disagree any more now than we did 40 years ago. The same is even true for LGBTQ rights. There's a gap, but it's not increasing. So again, as a scientist, you say, well, it feels like we're not really picking up polarization. If Merriam-Webster is literally defining it as extreme views, it is not. Our views are not extreme in that way. If you're inclined to look at these sorts of public opinion surveys. But what's interesting, and this is like I said, my favorite thing about data science is it doesn't mean there's no polarization, because it's sort of like you feel sick and you get a bunch of medical tests and everything comes back negative. It doesn't mean you're not sick, right? It just means we haven't run the right test.
Right.
So two fresh lenses from different political and data scientists over the last couple of decades that I wish we were talking about more. One is a political scientist in 2004 recognized that it's not the case that we're more extreme. It's that we used to occasionally hold a more diverse view. So pretend I'm just your average American. It used to be the case that I might be liberal on abortion, conservative on guns, conservative on government spending, and liberal on LGBTQ rights, something like that. And you might be another smattering. And so we would be somewhere in the middle. We'd have a few things to talk about because maybe we'd both be conservative on guns, even if we disagree on these other things. So he observed back in 2004 that what we've done is we've sorted. He calls it party sorting. And so it's no longer the case that we have overlapping views. If I'm liberal on one thing, I'm likely to be liberal on everything else. If I'm conservative on one thing, I'm likely to be conservative on everything else. So what that means is that we don't disagree any more than we used to. I'm just as far apart as you are on whatever issue, but we no longer have any in common where we say, well, at least we see eye to eye on abortion. At least we see eye to eye on government spending. And so that divide makes us feel more far apart from one another, when in fact, most people's views are pretty moderate, and we actually probably could agree. The second thing to note is more in the last 10 years is something called affective polarization, where it turns out if you say, what are your views on this issue? What are your views on that issue? Are you a strong member of this party or weak member? No movement, right? No meaningful movement. But if you say, what do you think of the other side? Our views have plummeted. So again, it's just we weren't asking the right questions. We weren't sifting through the right data. So our view, both sides, mind you, both the left and the right, say the other side are hypocrites. They're closed-minded. They're intolerant. They hate the country. We're both saying about the other side. And most of us think the other side is more extreme than they are. Most Republicans, not most Republicans, something like, one of my favorite pieces of data, something like 30% of Republicans think 30% of Democrats identify as LGBTQ. The real number is something between 3 and 6%.
Yeah.
Right? And then on the left, there are views towards the right. And so we just don't have an accurate read on the other side. So I was both excited when Merriam-Webster named polarization as the word of the year, but also very, very concerned because we're not actually polarized in the way that most of us are talking about it. And in fact, one of the arguments for why we hate each other is because we think we disagree more than we actually do. So this is one of those cases where, it's not so much fancy analysis, it's not machine learning, it's thinking about how we could actually turn the world into data in new, interesting ways. And so I really wish we would all talk about party sorting and affective polarization, but maybe that'll be 2025's word of the year. We'll see.
Yeah, we're sorted more than we are polarized.
Exactly right.
Because back in the day, the political parties were big tents.
That's right.
And they had diversity of opinion, but the political parties have found, because of multiple reasons outside the scope of today's show, that it makes more sense to collect opinions that oppose the other party because you can fundraise better, et cetera, et cetera. So that all makes sense.
And no one knows exactly what's causing it and why, but some of the more compelling theories that I am aware of, one is by Shanto Iyengar et al. In 2019. And their argument is that our political views, our political identity has become more salient. So we're still on the hunt for evidence to support this and keep testing this theory and all of these things. But the idea here is that it used to be the case that our political views were just like an opinion we had, like, I don't like broccoli, I prefer this policy, and now it's much more likely to be a central core piece of who we are. So I'm a mother and a sister and a Democrat, or whatever. Yeah, right. I will never reveal my politics, but
more of an identity.
So it's more of an identity, and so then we fight with each other more. And it turns out political campaigns and the media talking about how bad the other side is not helping anybody.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That is really none of the results that you talked about were surprising, but what the data science says about why they are, how they break out is incredibly useful to know. Thank you for sharing that with us.
My pleasure.
Last week, I had a chance to speak to Dr. Maryanne Garry, professor of psychology at the New Zealand Institute for Security and Crime Science at the University of Waikato, about why large language models can sound so persuasive to people. Dr. Garry has a paper coming out called Wires Crossed on Chatbots as Threats to Reality Monitoring. We've talked to you before, Maryanne, about the ways these things fool us. Get us up to speed since the last time we talked. What is going into the new things that you've been writing about?
Well, we've been taking a closer look at what is about these chat-based LLMs that fool us, and working through the dangers, and then maybe addressing some unanticipated dangers or less obvious dangers.
Why do they fool us? Let's start there, because I know we've talked about it a bit before, but we're always trying to figure out more about this. What is it about large language models that make us want to believe them, even those of us who know we probably shouldn't always believe them?
Yeah, well, there are a few reasons. I can give you just three for now. I think the primary clue is in the name chatbot, right? So we interact with them like we're having a conversation with a human being, some smart, professional, accurate, extremely skilled person. And we know that we mostly assume our conversation partners are being helpful and truthful, even when they're not, people that we think are trusted assistants, like a chatbot, right? These things are confident. We take confidence as a sign of credibility and accuracy. We think people in general who are confident know more, are more trustworthy. We give them higher status than their equally competent but less, more humble peers. And the problem is that overconfidence leads to problems. I mean, it leads to good things, like taking risks that pay off. You can see studies that successful CEOs tend to be more confident than maybe is warranted, right? But also overconfidence leads to wrongful convictions. It leads to bad medical errors. It leads to financial scams. All right, so that's one thing. Chatbots, like the newer versions of the models of ChatGPT, you might see them, they're like thinking out loud, right? Mm-hmm. Like an expert might work through a problem by thinking out loud, right? So instead of processing without feedback, ChatGPT does something now like it goes, I'm thinking, I'm translating, I'm figuring out, I'm adjusting my response. And are they doing anything like that? I mean, who knows, right? It might be like the progress bar on the Mac, in which it bears only a superficial relationship to reality. Or it might be some kind of plain English version of what's happening in the background. We don't know. And then also, because of all this stuff, when they refuse to answer, it often sounds like they know, but they won't tell you, which contributes to this I know more than you do vibe. It makes them more of an authority figure. So I think that's why they're built with features that make them easy to use, but also help them fool us.
Yeah. And again, we're not trying to say that they only ever fool us, but you know, there are instances when they do. And it can be useful to understand that, I don't know, it sounds from what you're saying, Dr. Garry, that it's kind of the same reason humans fool us, right? They're confident and they come off as trustworthy. Yeah.
They're like, they're like a human who's with superpowers, right?
Yeah.
They've got all the features of humans that we gravitate towards for assistance.
And a lot of those features, like especially of the voice activated ones where they pause and go, is meant to make them more approachable, which it does, but can also lend to that nature that you're talking about too, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's the difference between having like a nice graphical user interface and hopping on the terminal, right? So if OpenAI had said, here's our LLM, have at it. You'll have to use the terminal commands or just write some code. It would be, just nerd city, but it's not. And so it's meant to help people have an accessible start, to using these kinds of things. But you're right, plus and minuses.
I know that a lot of people who work with these are pointing out that they are hallucinating less, that they are getting more narrow and better, but there are still occasions, where they go awry. And I think probably a growing area of threat is not so much from kind of a random happenstance, but when people use them for malicious activities. What are some of the dangers of the fact that they are so convincing?
I think there are maybe obvious dangers and maybe less obvious dangers and more immediate dangers and more downstream dangers. So the obvious dangers is they make mistakes. They are hallucinating less. And it's also true that we've always encountered mistakes, but these are on a scale that we've not seen before. And coupled with these the features we just discussed that make them very trustworthy, right? The fact is, errors are baked into the model. There's a really nice paper in Nature by Zhou and colleagues that just came out this year showing that many of these chat-based LLMs prioritize accomplishing their task in order to, and this is a quote from the paper, look diligent by saying something meaningful at the cost of being wrong. It is a great and frightening line. And so compared to the paper that you talked about that we've got coming out, in which we took some of OpenAI's own data in August, they've now done a system card update for December. And so what you can see is that they've got a lower, let's call it misinformation rate. So just agnostic about, it's just error rate, right? So it's now dropped to much less than 1%, 0.17%. More than 20 of those are deliberate. And I don't like this anthropomorphication of the models, but this is the language that they use in computer science, right? So they call them deliberate, which means that it's as though the model knowingly knows it knowingly knows. That's genius. It deliberately, and let's head what that means, but it deliberately chooses to give you the right answer and perhaps to accomplish the task. And on the face of it, you can think, yeah, great. I mean, that's a risk I'm willing to take, 0.17. But it also kind of assumes that you would know when it's going to be wrong and when it's not going to be wrong, right? So you can weigh up the risks in some informed way. And if we go through a calculation that we did in that paper, but now update it with the December system card data, what we can see is that according to OpenAI's own information, every day users send 1 billion messages to ChatGPT. which is mind-blowing. That's every day. And so a very conservative estimate, if we just focus on just ChatGPT, is that you've got 1.7 million errors a day, right? More than 20% of which are like baked into this model, right? And so the dangers really are in the consequences that flow on from that. So you can say, yeah, well, who cares if it spits out some mango salad recipe that has no actual mangoes in it, right?
Right.
But even now, you can see it's that same process that will, give me, who cares, inconsequential errors, will also produce Wikipedia content that's generated by ChatGPT at estimated levels of 5%. Who knows what the error rate is in there, right? And the real danger, I think, is down the line in that when it comes to objective errors, people are going to start not knowing who to trust. We've already seen this happening in the US, in where I live in New Zealand, in other countries, right? What are the trusted sources? I don't know. Even among once trusted institutions. And it's going to be harder, particularly as these models start to feed each other and be trained on each other's errors to determine what really is true. So I think those are the obvious dangers. And I think the less obvious dangers that aren't really mistakes is that LLMs have often been touted as ideologically unbiased. And just like the media has always reflected values inherent to a country or a culture, or even who owns it, who owns like that media empire, right? It turns out that LLMs have a similar kind of tilt. And it's not that they're biased, but it's more that the idea of being neutral is itself kind of a culturally bound idea.
I see. Yeah.
So who designed them? Who trained them? The language in which you pose a query all shapes the kind of response you're going to get.
All right, we're going to finish our conversation with Dr. Garry in just a second. But real quickly, I want to remind folks that if there is something you would like to hear about on the show, one way to let us know is in our subreddit. You can submit stories and vote on them at reddit.com/r/dailytechnewsshow.
So it seems mind-numbingly obvious, right? That if I query a chatbot in China and I ask, a question about how great the EU is, it's going to be less great than if I query Claude, right?
Yeah.
Something like that, right?
When you asked me about the University of Illinois, that I'm not going to give you an objective answer. Same kind of thing. Yeah, no, that's
and just like if you asked me about New Jersey.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you from New Jersey?
Yeah. Yeah. Shh, don't tell anyone.
Okay. Well, that's
and even within the same country, you can find different ways that the similar information is reported, right? So that, for instance, even in the US, OpenAI produces on a number of aspects more right-leaning answers, right? About so ideas about internationalization. It's got a slightly, more critical evaluation about welfare policies, multiculturalism, whereas Gemini is like on the other end, right? It's more social justice-y, more workers' rights, right? And so you can see, and again, you might be like, well, who cares? I don't have to pay attention to that kind of stuff. But you could see how it could matter.
Right. Yeah. And you don't know by looking at it, right? You can't just look at OpenAI's website and glean all of that.
Right.
So,
and it's not just how it's trained, right? It's also how it's tuned. It's also how they respond to, like, how they, to the extent to which the reinforcement at the level of like this is good feedback. Thanks. I like this response, whatever, then changes the weights.
Yeah, that's becoming a bigger weight. I think that's important for people to understand, is that the training data does have bias in it. It always will. It's a matter of accounting for it. The tuning is an attempt to correct for that bias sometimes, but also do other things like ensure more accurate answers and everything. And the tuning will have bias because the tuning's done by humans, right?
Right. And it's just like people, right? So when tuning is really learning, right? So I put my hand on a burner. I learn not to put it there again. That's a kind of feedback, and it's immediate. But I also get punished for something I do or don't do, and it keeps shaping as I develop. So this is like a developmental psychology sort of thing, like how these models are growing up, and they're responding to basically praise and punishment in ways that are like pre-tuned.
Yeah, like puppies.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So I think people would be forgiven in some cases for hearing all this and saying, great, I'm not ever using these. No one else should use them. I think that would be unfortunate because there is a lot of good coming out of them, a lot of productivity that can be made good use of. What do you think? What do you think we should do about it?
Well, I think there's a lot of be aware. I think the danger is, so there's danger in people who just try one of these things for the first time or don't know any of this stuff, right? And maybe they'll use it to make a spreadsheet. Now, if the spreadsheet doesn't work, the spreadsheet doesn't work, right? But again, those errors that cause problems will also cause problems when you don't know. Now, I think there's another danger in an audience like this one, which is sophisticated, technologically sophisticated audience, will think they're somehow inoculated. Yeah, I know that it does this kind. I know that it's not knowing. I know that it's just fancy predictive text. I know it's this kind of thing. So, and as of now, there's some research suggesting that even in the face of this unprecedented wave of misinformation coming at us at scale, we are not, even experts are not rising to meet the moment. So we don't catch a number of errors either, right? In
our own personal processing of information, you're saying, not just fact checkers on Twitter or something.
Right. So I sometimes use both either ChatGPT or Claude. I like them, right? And I will sometimes use it for code. I'll use it for cleaning data analysis. I'll use it to rearrange things in a spreadsheet, things I don't feel. And then that's fine, because if it doesn't work, I know it doesn't work. But I've also down the track had come to realize something that's like a statistical issue that I should have known, but I just went, okay. And then only by unraveling it did I think this is nonsense. And it's not that it's bad at that kind of thing. It's just that there's similar errors that cut across, its training corpus, right? And it'll be better at constrained issues, like code, things that are out there a lot on the internet that it can just grab, right? And maybe less great at, the more it's interpolating or extrapolating even.
Yeah. So if I were to sum it up, it sounds like be aware of the limitations, be aware that it can still fool you if you're aware, and try to use it in narrower ways. Is that fair?
Yeah, I have taken to saying, what are your sources for this? And then I would say even about half the time it backs right down. It's fascinating.
Oh, you mean you ask the chatbot itself, what are your sources? Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah. Or I just now try and triangulate my sources. Well, that makes it sound like I, as a professor, have only realized that I should do this. It's not, but but I think that's good for everybody to do.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we have only touched on the surface of this because it is, it is the beginning of a huge change in how we do things. But thanks for helping us wrap our heads around it a little more. If people want to find out more about what you are doing these days, where should they go?
I'm Dr. Lambchop on everything. That's how they can find me. And also you can Google me at the University of Waikato and you'll pick up my email address there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Garry.
Sure thing.
Now, we didn't coordinate this, Andrea, but there was, I don't know if you noticed it, quite a lot that overlapped between the conversation I had with Dr. Garry on Friday and what we talked about earlier in the show.
Totally. And to the point, you should have just said you coordinated it, because I was sitting there being like, oh, it's like a whole misinformation, polarization, bias kind of day. So,
yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think the concerns she has will certainly make polarization worse and will probably make our own ideas and our ideas about what the ideas that other people have even harder to reconcile.
Yeah. It's something to be aware of at the very minimum. Like what she was saying.
I so appreciated her point, and that you summed up so well, that it's be aware even if you're aware, I think is such a huge, because I'm sitting here, I was exactly guilty of, I was like, well, but I know, so I'm not gonna.
I was that person most of the way through the interview until she said that. And I'm like, oh yeah, no, I'm that guy.
We're just going to have to, like, every 6 months come on and be like, even if you're aware, you're not aware. And then you add another aware, like, every single time to get more and more cautious.
Absolutely. Well, Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today. Congrats on the launch of Behind the Data. Tell folks more about that and where they can find it.
Sure. Well, thank you for making Behind the Data possible. So Behind the Data is my show. We just wrapped season 1. It was 8 episodes, and it exists because of you all. I ran it as a pilot in DTNS Experiment Week in August. We ran one about political polls. And so Tom, Roger, and listeners, thanks for your support. I went ahead and did 7 more. And the show really is kind of like the polarization issue we talked about today, is to say, look, there's a lot of data in the world, and it's doing a lot of really interesting things, LLMs, AI, machine learning, all of that. But also the data itself, understanding where it came from, how we measure it, just what we can learn from it, and kind of the philosophical exercise, like the polarization example that we just talked about, that you have to go through to think about, well, how would this be data? And how can we learn from that data, is itself very, very interesting. And I think speaking of polarization, I think a lot of our disagreements in the world that are based in data, so things like crime rates, that disagreement largely comes from a misunderstanding of where the data comes from in the first place. And so, for example, episode 2 in Behind the Data is all about crime data. I interviewed someone named Jeff Asher, who's a crime data researcher based out of New Orleans, and has a real-time crime index of his own that he just launched. And so he's very cool to follow. Jeffalytics is his Substack. And so we talked at length about, look, a crime happens. It doesn't just show up in a spreadsheet somewhere. Like, a bunch of different things have to happen in order for it to show up in a spreadsheet, and the way that it shows up in the spreadsheet, and then when it shows up in the spreadsheet, and then how we learn from it. And so there's a lot more thinking that has to happen at every single stage. And so I basically do things like that about data sets that are in the news and that are of interest. And I also have a few more, and I could obviously talk about this forever, but I also have a few that are more like personal data. So I interviewed someone named Christy Ashwandon. I actually have her book right here. She is a elite athlete and a science journalist, and she does a ton of research on things like fitness apps and data around dehydration and health and nutrition and recovery. Very ripe for pseudoscience. And so it's a lot about how to make sense of, my phone is screaming at me about how much I'm sleeping or how many steps I'm taking. Is that useful information? How should we be thinking about that information? How can we be more thoughtful consumers of that information? So a lot of it is data that's kind of that we're interacting with every single day as well.
Fantastic stuff, folks. Go find it at behindthedatashow.com. Also, thanks to all the people who ordered our stickers. We made these crazy stickers. They're Len Peralta's art. It's me, Roger Chang, Sarah Lane, and a lot of you must have liked them because we've sold a bunch of them. They're still out there, $4.99 each or $12.99 for all 3 with free shipping. So if you're like, oh, right, I forgot about the stickers, head over to dailytechnewsshow.com/store. Patrons, stick around for the extended show Good Day Internet. Meta's Ray-Ban smart glasses are getting live conversations with its AI and few other features. Are we ready to wear AI on our face? We're going to talk about it. Catch the show live if you like, Monday through Friday, 4 p.m. Eastern, 2100 UTC, dailytechnewsshow.com/live. And we're back tomorrow with PC Mag's Emily Forlini talking about Apple intelligence. Is it really Apple and intelligent? Find out tomorrow.
The DTNS family of podcasts, helping each other understand.
Diamond Club hopes you have enjoyed this program.